All right, this video is going to walk you through how to do the lesson on graphing calculator maximum and minimum, also information about intervals of increase, decrease, and also intervals of when the graph is positive. All right, so here's the first part. We're going to teach the left side of this worksheet, so if you happen to have this worksheet printed out and you're looking at it, here's what we got to do. We're going to do the left side, and you're going to try to do the right side on your own. So here's the first part. You're going to be asked to graph some kind of equation on your homework or on this sheet here right now, and you need to type it in correctly. It's very important that when you have more than one item in the bottom of a denominator, that you group it with an extra pair of parentheses. Now you'll see it's already given to you in this one, but some homework questions may not have an extra pair of parentheses for the entire denominator when there's multiple things down here. So it's very important you do that, otherwise you're not going to create the right kind of graph. So here's my calculator. You'll notice I've typed in all the information as you see it. Then from there, you're going to hit graph. Hopefully you'll see that, hey, there's a little bump and it kind of looks like what I'm supposed to get right over here too as well. So far things are looking pretty good. Now the next question is going to ask you is find the maximum. The maximum is going to be found by you going to this option that says trace, but right above it, it says calculate. We're going to calculate the maximum. So press second, trace, and you'll notice it says maximum right here at number 4. Then when it says left bound in the lower left corner of your screen, you're going to press make sure the cursor is to the left of that lowest point. You're going to press enter. Then it says right bound. Make sure your cursor is to the right of the maximum point you're trying to find. So I'll then press enter again. When it says guess question mark, press enter one last time. So you're essentially going to do 3 enters in a row and then eventually get your coordinate. Now notice it's not perfect. It says 3.0000, then a 9 and 2.5. That is essentially 3, 2.5. That is how you find a maximum, 3, 2.5. Now, if you're asked to find the minimum, you do the exact same thing. You'll press second, trace, and then choose minimum. But you have to have a little bit of knowledge about minimums. If this graph ever kept going down forever, you cannot have a minimum. It has to actually stop at some point. Now, your knowledge about asymptotes, this graph gets really close to 0 but never equals 0. So that means this left side is always getting a little smaller every time you go to the left, forever. And the same thing over here. So this left side and right side never stops going down. So therefore, we're going to say it has no minimum because it's always getting closer to 0 but never touching 0. So this is going to be D and E for this one right here on your homework and also for the sheet. Now, if you're asked to find x-intercepts, remember from yesterday you have to put in a second equation. If you're trying to find x-intercepts, y2 has to say 0. So if I put a 0 there, now, unfortunately, though, have a little knowledge of this. If this is getting close to 0, never touching, never getting close to 0, never touching, this will never have x-intercepts. But still, let's take a look at what it looks like when you don't have them on the screen. If you press second trace, choose option 5 now for where it crosses the x-axis, enter, 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 it's going to say error, no sign change. So that means it is not crossing the x-axis, at least on the screen as we see it. So you cannot have an x-intercept in this question. So again, this one is going to be D and E also. Okay, and then the letter Y, or the y-intercepts. Y-intercepts, the best way to find a y-intercept is to simply go to your table. You'll see the graph key right here. Press second graph, go to the table, and then look down to where there's a 0 on the table. So if you scroll down to right here, you put your cursor on the 0, and you'll notice that when you put your cursor on the actual y value, this right here is the y-intercept. So always go to your table, find 0 in the table, that number right there is your y-intercept. So I'm going to say 0, 0.769. So 0, 0.769. Hopefully that wasn't too hard to find the y-intercept on that one as well. Now, moving on. Sometimes we aren't going to ask you to graph things. We're going to ask you just to look at a graph, and then we're going to investigate this graph. There are a lot of things on this investigation that we're going to do here in a moment. Oops, let me just get it all to fit. And we're going to go through this left side here first. Now, domain. Domain is referring to how far left and how far right the graph goes. So if I highlight the x-axis, which is the left and right numbers, we're going to say this graph covers what numbers on that blue line? Well, it goes and starts at a black dot here at -5. So -5 is the left amount. The right side is an arrow. It may be hard to see that. There's an arrow going up here forever. So that means then this thing goes off to the right over here to infinity forever also. So this is going to be positive infinity. Now, if we're using notation for interval notation with parentheses and brackets, you're starting at 5, and you're going to include it. When you want to include it, you use a bracket. If you're going to then go off to infinity, since it never stops, we are going to use a parenthesis. That's how that first one works. The range. The range is all the y values. So that means all the numbers along this y-axis that are pink. So if we say this graph exists where between what numbers and what numbers of that pink y-axis, well, it goes as low as -3 and it goes up forever. So that means I'm going to say it goes to the bottom at -3 and it goes up to the top here for positive infinity. Next, again, it starts and includes -3 on the y-axis, so that means I need a bracket for the -3, and since the infinity never stops at a number, we're going to leave that as a parenthesis on the right side. Next, if we're talking about x-intercepts, just look at the graph. It crosses here 3 times. I got one here in the, at -4, 0. I got one at 0, 0, and I've got one at 4, 0. So 3 x-intercepts. Hopefully you can see all 3 of those. Next, if it asks you for a y-intercept, you're looking where does it cross the y-axis that's pink here. That's just crossing right here at 0, 0. So you'll put 0, 0 down for your y-intercept. Next, the maximum. A maximum is a spot the graph eventually stops at. Well, it continues to shoot up forever, so you do not have a maximum when there's arrows that shoot up forever. So in this case right here, this will be a D and E. However, it does have some peaks that it did peak out at. We call this a relative maximum. If you want to label your graph, that would help you for your notes as well, but this is a relative max, and that coordinate is at -2, 3. So your relative max is at -2, 3. Next, if you're talking about the minimum, what's the lowest this graph gets to? The lowest number on the y-axis this gets down to is this right here. So in this case here, that dot right there is your minimum, and that's as low as -3, and we're going to use a coordinate to describe it. So it's going to be -5, -3. Since it did stop there, we can say that coordinate is the minimum. Now, the relative minimum is, did it bottom out anywhere? Well, yeah, it bottomed out right here. This is a relative minimum, because it's not the minimum, it's a relative minimum where it bottomed out at 2, -2. So that's a relative minimum, 2, -2. Next, if we're talking about intervals of increase and decrease, you think about yourself when you get on a roller coaster. Right when you get in the car, are you going up or down? No, because you're trying to put the seatbelt on and the car is stopped. But then you start moving, and as you go through these graphs today, deciding when it increases and decreases, you're always doing it the same way you read a book. You move across it from left to right. As you go across from left to right, this thing is going up from there to there. And then eventually, as you're going to describe that up amount, you're only going to always use these blue numbers on the x-axis. You do not ever use the y numbers. So just when did this thing start going up? Well, at -5 is when you started, and it kept going up till you got to -2. So this thing is an interval that goes from -5 over to -2. Now notice I'm using parentheses. This starts at -5. I do not want to include it because it is not going up. Okay? So therefore, I want to have -5, -2. And then also, when I hit the peak of a hill, you're not going to be going up or down either. So that's why we also don't put a bracket on the right side of the interval of increase. Now, you also look a little carefully. You'll notice that you're going to go down a hill, but then you go back up again right here. So you go back up again the hill right there. So that means then you have 2 of these intervals of when it goes up. So we need to union that with the other time it goes back up again. And that happens right here at +2. And then as I continue along the blue line here, it keeps going up forever as it goes up and out. So it's never going to stop to the right going up as I go from 2 off to infinity. So I'm going to go 2 off to infinity. And that is your intervals, in this case, of increase of when it happened 2 times. Now notice also we have a time when it does go down. It goes down from that peak of the hill and then to the bottom where it dips out at the relative minimum. So therefore, in this case right here, there is a segment from -2 over to +2 when this thing is going down as you move across from left to right. So this this interval of decrease is going to be between the numbers -2 and +2. Now, lastly, if you have an extra highlighter, find another color if you could, and highlight when the graph goes above the x-axis. It happens right here, and it also happens right here. So now, what you're going to describe in this picture is when is the graph positive or above the x-axis? Well, you'll notice it starts here, and again, like I said, with the intervals of increase, decrease, and these intervals of when it's positive and negative, you're always going to use numbers off the x-axis, these blue numbers. Do not use the pink numbers, just the blue x-axis numbers. All right, so in this case right here, it's positive from when you're at -4 over to 0. So -4 over to 0. Now, I also want to make a point that 0 is not positive or negative, okay? It's neither. So that means you cannot include -4 as a positive value. So we're going to use parentheses to show that. Now I'm going to use a union because it happened again twice. So we're going to union that with the other time it happens when it goes positive, starting at 4, and then forever off to the right is when you have this thing above the x-axis. So positive 4, and then off to infinity. Next. And lastly, when this thing is going to be negative, you want to take your highlighter and just think of it this way. I'm going to use pink for my negative. It's over here, and then it happens to be negative from here to here. One thing to note, it is starting negative at that dot, so you're going to have a bracket here. You'll notice in your homework, if this happens to you too, this is the one time you will mix in some brackets because it is starting negative, and it is included negative at -5. And then lastly, if you go to the right, it stops at -4 and then is not negative at -4. So then the next thing you'll have to do is union that with the other piece when it is negative. That's from 0 over to this 4 right here, and it's not negative at either of those starting and stopping points, so that means you go 0 to 4. Now I hope this information helps as you get a better understanding of today's lesson. Now try the homework and see what you guys can do with that. Good luck, and I hope this helps.